Heaven sent.
Throughout the progression of technology and its many advances within the gaming industry, video games have arguably become one of the most influential art forms of all time, giving us the ability to immerse ourselves within a world much unlike our own, and to become a part of something that defies reality. Throughout the storied history of one of mankind's most beloved hobbies, these remarkable experiences have shaped multiple generations of gamers, leaving us with lasting memories, life lessons, and a reminder to always keep trying, no matter how many times you fail. And with so many options to choose from, it's safe to say that there's a video game out there for everyone. But with the vast amount of titles at our disposal in present day, it's important to remember the golden years that shaped an influence for these games to exist. Much before digital downloads, cloud streaming, and ease of access to online play, things were in a bit of a primal state, relying on the player to use a bit more of their imagination in order to further their immersion. But gaming in the 90s was well on its way to evolving at a rapid pace, with three-dimensional worlds becoming commonplace. The capabilities of 5th-gen hardware were allowing developers to create their games in more visual detail than ever before. And not only that, it also allowed them to tell stories with a much greater presentation. So in the vein of nostalgia and the celebration of one of the industry's most incredible years, I thought we could begin our journey into the golden age of gaming with the wonderful year of 1998, covering the many influential releases of its impressive catalog and revisiting some of the incredible memories these games were able to create. For me personally, this was the year in which my passion for gaming had truly began to bloom, and for many of you out there, I'm sure you can relate. So without further ado, join me as we travel back into the year of 1998, an iconic year for gaming.
I wanted
to see the juice squirt out of your family like the 4th of July.
Biohazard 2.
While video games have been known to cover a wide variety of topics and playstyles throughout the years, most will share the common factor of trying to make their experience fun or enjoyable. But when it came to the release of Resident Evil 2, fear had become the primary ingredient in fueling one of the most iconic survival horror games of all time. Going back to the release of the very first title of the series, Resident Evil, the game's director, Shinji Mikami, was aiming to create an experience in which its players would have to tread carefully and think about their decisions in-game, solving puzzles, preserving ammo and health, as well as strategizing on what battles to take on or pass. These were the elements in which he hoped to instill into the game's narrative, birthing the now renowned genre of survival horror. And with the critical success of his first game amassing an incredible following almost instantly, Mikami and his team at Capcom were eager to get to work on their next entry. The very first glimpse of their new sequel was reluctantly showcased at the 96 V-Jump Festival, with the infamous Resident Evil 1.5 build being shown to many excited fans of the series. This build was much different than the final version that we would eventually see, with a new character by the name of Elza Walker being one of the two main protagonists. Mikami had revealed the sequel to include a wider variety of enemy types, as well as the ambitious decision to increase the number of on-screen enemies, but changes like these would come at a cost. Due to the technical limitations of the PlayStation 1, the developers would have to compromise visual quality in order to fulfill the demands of more on-screen zombies. But other such upgrades were luckily planned to be in store, with the planned use of wear and tear on characters and their equipment, as well as altered pre-rendered backgrounds all being added to enhance the game's immersion. With everything running smooth around the time of the game's reveal, Mikami was in belief that it would be finished by its projected release of May 1997. But unfortunately, things didn't quite go as planned, with the 1.5 version eventually being scrapped at well over 60% of its completion, with Mikami adding that most of the gameplay and design seemed much too dull. He was planning to end the series completely in the sequel, but the game's supervisor, Yoshiki Okamoto, was hoping to expand this catalog much further and create a universe that would evolve into a meta-series with many different storylines and characters within. During the revision of RE2's story, they began consulting a professional screenwriter by the name of Noboru Sugimura, who eventually became the composer of the game's entire narrative, and was actually the one responsible in trading out Elza Walker for fan-favorite heroine, Claire Redfield. giving her a more suitable purpose for coming to Raccoon City, as well as having a compatible storyline alongside Leon Kennedy. They recycled what assets they could from the 1.5 build and began to develop them with higher detail. Taking inspiration from the interiors of Western-style buildings in Japan, they eventually came to create one of the most iconic locations in gaming history, the Raccoon City Police Department. They also opted for limiting the number of on-screen characters to a max of 7, and switched out the idea of visible wounds for having the players limp upon receiving enough damage, which would also slow them down, making the player more vulnerable to attack, thus increasing the thrill of its gameplay. The traditional use of tank controls were still intact, and an impressive variety of FMVs were also created for use in telling the game's narrative. Unfortunately though, the model for Ada Wong couldn't be completed in time, making her the only main character to not appear in an FMV. But it's okay, Capcom. You guys definitely made up for that in due time. But anyways, things were looking very impressive for the release of Resident Evil 2, and with the widespread following of RE lovers all over the globe, they were about to experience arguably one of the greatest sequels in gaming history. Resident Evil 2 was officially released for the Sony PlayStation on January 21st, 1998, and was seeing nothing but praise all across the board. Aiming to engage its players with the stories of two different characters, Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, the game was released with 2 separate discs, each one being assigned to its respective storyline. Both being an incredible introduction on 2 of the Resident Evil universe's most beloved characters. Without spoiling too much about the game's story, I'll just simply say, it's definitely one you don't want to miss. As far as the impact of Resident Evil 2 goes, it's without a doubt one of the most influential games of its genre, taking what foundation was laid for survival horror in its previous entry, tightening the screws, and delivering an experience that has been unforgettable for multiple generations. Whether you were like me, a traumatized 7-year-old who was terrified at the sight of their very first liquor zombie, or being there as an adult to truly soak in the ambiance and story of this game at release, Resident Evil 2 was a major mark in the history of gaming, and is a title that is still being talked about to this very day. And with the year of 1998 being so stacked with a litany of classics, it's only right that we kick this journey off with one of Capcom's greatest accomplishments. But moving on to our next subject, it's time for us to boot up our old Windows 98 desktop, grab a couple of screaming cold root beers, and get ready to tuck in for a night of harvesting minerals and Zerg rushes. So without further ado, let's take a trip back to the 1998 release of Starcraft. The genre of real-time strategy, better known as RTS, is one that isn't typically favored by your average gamer. While there are some incredibly rewarding experiences to be had within titles of this genre, the overall complexity and seemingly chaotic nature of RTS can be somewhat daunting for newcomers. While the average gaming experience can be learned within the first few minutes or so of playtime, RTS games rely on the focus of strategy and careful planning, meaning you won't get very far with an array of careless button presses. And with the real-time aspect challenging players to react on the fly with little to no room for error, this can sometimes be a bit much for some. But it's also no secret that a handful of certain RTS series have made themselves a household name for gamers all over the globe. And in the top 3 of most infamous, few have made such an impact as the Starcraft series. The development of the very first Starcraft game had begun in 1995 by Blizzard Entertainment. Following the success of the most recent project of Warcraft 2, Blizzard were looking to expand their RTS expertise into a whole new direction. Taking the universe into a more futuristic approach and placing the setting in space, the original build of Starcraft hadn't fared too well in its debut to V396, and was actually facing comparison to another game at that time by the name of Dominion 3, which later came to be a scandal in its own, with the Dominion 3 presentation actually being staged. But anywho, fans weren't all too hot on the idea of Starcraft initially, and with the team at Blizzard taking note of its criticisms, they wanted to be sure that the playstyle would be original and in its own, be a major departure from the Warcraft series. One of the game's producers, Bill Roper, had compared the gameplay to a game of chess, where players will be able to plan accordingly depending on what faction they choose, finding the weaknesses of their opposition and capitalizing on the strengths of their own. And after straightening out a few technical issues in development, the game was eventually released on March 31st, 1998. But before we get into the critical reception of its debut, let's take a moment to discuss the innovations of their final product. The game's narrative, taking place in the distant future of 2259, you'll be embarking on a multitude of campaigns, spanning across 3 of the game's different races. Each campaign having ties to one another, and also gives the player an opportunity to experiment with the different abilities of each faction. The atmosphere of the game is wonderfully crafted, with a bleak, futuristic setting being further complemented by its dark and moody soundtrack. The game also featured some impressive voice acting, as well as a plethora of FMV cutscenes. And going back to it after so many years, I gotta say, I can see why this game was such a big deal. Everything you could ever ask for in an RTS is here in Starcraft. It presents itself with a timeless atmosphere. With the typical resource management and base building mechanics being a major part of the gameplay, what really set Starcraft apart was in its use of the previously mentioned variety of factions. For most RTS titles at the time, the differences between them were mostly cosmetic, but the gameplay on both sides of the field were always similar. In Starcraft, the battlefield is greatly weighed on the knowledge of your faction of choice, with a heavy importance on understanding their strengths and weaknesses. For example, you begin the game's campaign as the human faction of Terran. This faction offers a more balanced playstyle, finding a middle ground between the other 2 opposing races, while the Protoss are more technologically advanced, relying on powerful equipment and lengthy crafting times to achieve their mission, and the infamous Zerg faction, having a strategy that's highly dependent on the number of their troops. These different playstyles brought something fresh to the world of RTS, and created an experience that was unique to each of its players, and combining that with the traditional formula, made StarCraft an instant classic for fans of the genre, and upon its release, the impact was felt worldwide. Becoming the best-selling PC game in the year of 1998, with over 1.5 million units sold, Blizzard had knocked it out of the park, and the critics had nothing but praise for their efforts. And while the release of StarCraft was obviously a huge deal at the time, the impact of its reach would only continue to grow with time. One example of this being in its massive growth as a professional sport in South Korea, making it one of the first widely celebrated esports titles of its kind, filling stadiums of fans to watch the best players compete, and even having StarCraft-themed bars for further spectating pleasure. And one of the things I love most about playing these games of the 90s is getting to revisit the many innovations in gaming at that time, as it's really incredible how many games in present day were influenced by some of the experimental decisions made by their predecessors. But as for the case of StarCraft and its ambitious nature, it's safe to say that it will forever be regarded as one of the greatest RTS series of all time. The next game on our list begins with one of the most prolific military novelists of all time, the late and powerful Tom Clancy. A man whose work is well recognized among gamers of multiple generations, his rise to fame had first began with the release of his debut novel, The Hunt for Red October, a story set in the Cold War, which was also the introduction of one of his most famed characters, Jack Ryan. He went on to continue in the tradition of writing military novels and even began working with Hollywood, having a wide selection of his writing being made into films. His first adaptation had began in 1990, with the Red October movie being filmed and released to critical acclaim. And with the gaming industry also making a steady rise at this time, Mr. Clancy began talks of having a hand in writing for future releases. The very first game he had worked on under the Tom Clancy name was Tom Clancy's SSN, a submarine simulation game that was released on the Windows PC. But just 2 years later, his work on a certain IP would solidify his name into gaming history. Released on August 21st, 1998, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six had began its inception, giving players a unique perspective on the world of tactical shooters. With Rainbow Six being centered around a counterterrorism unit, the game's development team, Red Storm Entertainment, was aiming to create an immersive experience for its players. Beginning with the strategy aspects found within the game, before each mission, you will be assigned to command different units of your overall squad, and also being given the ability to plan routes in which your units will be tasked with following. Each enemy engagement is dangerous, and the familiar run and gun method will be of no use if you want to see your mission through. While enemies only require a few carefully placed shots to take them down, the same can be said about yourself and squad mates, making careful planning a necessity. Another interesting aspect within the story mode is the fact that once you lose a squad mate, they are gone for good. So the stakes are high in keeping them safe, if you want to have the most help as possible throughout your campaign. and with 16 different missions being available for the original port, you've got a long way to go in keeping your squad alive. While the level of difficulty could be off-putting to fans of the typical shooter, Rainbow Six was a breath of fresh air for others. It's almost like a perfect mix between the two genres of action and strategy, and pairing that with the intensity of each mission and impressive level of immersion is what made this game so special for its time. For me personally, this was one of the first computer games I had ever owned, but it's one I stuck with for many years. The visuals are very on brand with its year of release, but the level of depth within its gameplay still makes it one of my favorite Tom Clancy games ever. As you can imagine, Rainbow Six was met with a widely positive reception, and went on to be released to a litany of other ports for console and handheld. And what's so interesting about this title is how much of an impact it had in creating the insane catalog of Tom Clancy games thereafter. With the Rainbow Six series continuing on to release over 13 entries and counting, and as for its hand in the world of tactical shooters, I strongly believe it was an inspiration for other IPs such as the SWAT series. But if one thing's for sure, it's that Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six is a true gem in the history of 90s gaming, and is one that's still worth experiencing in present day. Much like the last game of discussion, our next entry is one that is fueled by strategy and tactical espionage, spawning one of the most iconic characters in all of gaming history and bringing worldwide reverence to its legendary creator, Hideo Kojima, comes my personal favorite, Metal Gear Solid. While the Metal Gear series had originated on the MSX2 and NES consoles of the late 80s, its greatest form was finally realized on September 3rd, 1998. Being released as a PlayStation 1 exclusive, Metal Gear Solid intended to capitalize on the technological advancements of Sony's debut console, and jam-packed 2 CD-ROMs with the incredible tale of Solid Snake. And while I would typically go into a rant about how this game came to be, I've already done so multiple times in different videos. So this time around, let's just talk about what made it so unbelievably good as a video game. Beginning with the story, Metal Gear Solid follows the main character of Solid Snake, a highly respected soldier with more than enough combat experience to fuel an army. Taking place in an alternate history in which the Cold War had continued on into the 90s, the game's narrative begins in the year of 2005. A remote Alaskan island has been compromised by a terrorist group named Foxhound, who are threatening the use of a nuclear-capable mech, or Metal Gear Rex. And to erase these threats, they're hoping to be given the remains of a fallen Foxhound member by the name of Big Boss, as well as a ransom of $1 billion. And with these threats, our protagonist Snake is called out of retirement and sent to a nuclear weapons facility codenamed Shadow Moses. Snake is tasked with locating 2 separate hostages on the island, as well as preventing the launch of any nuclear weapons. And with Snake being a lone wolf on this mission, it's up to the player to keep his presence unknown. Much like the original 80s release of Metal Gear, Kojima wanted the gameplay to remain focused on stealth, in which they included a wide variety of mechanics to aid the player in staying under the radar. You can hug walls, take cover under boxes and within lockers, as well as a handful of tools that can be put to use to jam up surveillance. Snake is also no stranger to close quarters combat, and can quietly incapacitate any of his enemies one-on-one. But going back to the game's narrative, the story found within Metal Gear Solid is truly what makes the game so iconic. While the gameplay features plenty of situations to get your brain working and heart rate rising, the vast amount of well-written cutscenes are a nice respite in between stressful sneaking missions. And while the majority of the game's cutscenes are pretty lengthy, you'll be sure to find yourself engaged the entire way through. The game's writers, Hideo Kojima and Tomokazu Fukushima, did an absolutely amazing job at keeping you immersed within the complex storyline. And not only that, but the wide cast of memorable characters will make it very hard for you to pick a favorite. The game's use of a codec to communicate with others plays a major part in the immersion. The codec also plays an important role in guiding your way through each mission, with the ability to contact your theme for advice whenever you find yourself stuck. It's a wonderful mechanic, and one that I've always loved dearly about the Metal Gear series. But what I've always found most fascinating about the universe of these games is the wonderful mix of supernatural themes with real-world history. The story of Metal Gear is heavily influenced by the history of war in many different ways, but they also found a way to capitalize on more obscure military topics such as psychic units and bioengineered super soldiers. It has a very sci-fi feel to it at times, and even has some rather creepy elements to it as well, with antagonists such as Psycho Mantis being sure to provide you with plenty of unsettling moments throughout your playthrough. And speaking of Psycho Mantis, let's dive a bit more into the innovative aspects of the game. With Kojima having a love for movies, he aimed to make the game as cinematic as possible. One way that he did so was in the tasteful presentation of his cutscenes, but he also kept in mind that this was a video game, and with immersion being an important factor, him and the team at Konami decided to introduce a few new mechanics, one of which being included in the Psycho Mantis boss fight, in which he was able to read the players' minds by diving into their memory card data and commenting on the games they were playing. Environmental concerns such as footprints in the snow, enemies becoming alerted by sounds, and even the common cold being introduced as a game mechanic, the ability to change perspective from first and third person, and, as we had previously mentioned, the use of a codec, all being innovative mechanics. And to be honest, there really aren't enough words for me to do this game justice, as it's one of those titles that just has to be experienced in order to understand why it's so widely praised. This is the game that put Hideo Kojima on the map for being one of the most unique storytellers in gaming, and had influenced a barrage of other stealth IPs in its wake. It introduced the importance of good writing in video games, and highlighted the fact that not every action game has to follow the same formula. It did something truly special with Metal Gear Solid, and for me, it's my personal favorite game of '98. But that doesn't mean our journey ends here, because we've got plenty more to cover on this iconic year. And for our next game, I'm sure you'll be feeling a heavy dose of nostalgia in our report of it. So get your gems ready, because it's time to fly in the 1998 release of Spyro the Dragon. Platforming games have been a staple in the gaming industry well since its storied inception. And with the majority of these platformers birthing some of the most iconic mascots in gaming, it's really no surprise that damn near every early developer had taken their shot at creating the next big name in platforming. With Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Crash Bandicoot all leaving a lasting impression on gamers of the 80s and 90s, Burbank developer Insomniac Studios were looking to capitalize on this trend and see if they had what it takes to invent their very own icon. With the demographic at that time shifting more towards children and teens, they decided it would be best for them to create a game that was welcome to all ages. And with the N64 dominating the family-friendly market with games such as Super Mario 64, Sony was pushing Insomniac to move in a similar direction. They decided they wanted the game to center around a dragon, and developed an engine that specialized in open world play. This powerful engine allowed the gameplay to include features such as flying, vast open spaces, and plenty of dynamic environments. And after careful planning and execution, we came to see the release of Spyro the Dragon on the PlayStation 1. If you were a 90s baby, I'm inclined to believe that this game was a big part of your childhood. And while the game sold a bit poorly at launch, that Christmas season of '98 was bringing the lovable purple dragon to disk drives all over the world. As we had mentioned before, they designed a pretty powerful engine to make sure this game would stand out from its competitors. And stand out, it did. Many critics praised the game for detailed level design, the depth of exploration found within each location in game, and the overall charm of the game's characters, making it one of the most beloved platformers of its time. And while its target demographic may have been aimed at a younger audience, Spyro came to be one of those games that was loved by all. It's one of those titles that I'll always look back on fondly, and one that I'm sure many of you have as well. Spyro has went on to create a legacy that has spanned multiple generations now, and has been a poster child for PlayStation for as long as I can remember. So if you ever find yourself looking for a little trip to the past, Spyro is sure to satiate any cravings of nostalgia. So order yourself a pizza and break out the beanbag chair. It's time to fly. When revisiting the state of gaming in the 1990s, you'll come to find that the trend of console gaming was easily the most popular method across the board. With the rise in PlayStation and N64 sales skyrocketing throughout the mid-90s, it seemed as though the entire world were shifting their focus on controllers and memory cards rather than keyboard and mouse. Console gaming just seemed a bit more convenient, with the simplicity of plug and play being a more reasonable option for your casual gamer. But for those with a little extra coin in their pocket and an even greater interest in the hobby, PC gaming was swiftly becoming the hardcore gamer's primary choice. And with an emphasis on first-person shooters being a popular genre for the PC, it's no surprise that some of the most influential were spawned in this very same era. and for one man by the name of Gabe Newell, he looked to create one of the greatest FPS series of all time. Beginning in the year of 1996, Valve Software was founded by Mr. Newell and his partner, Mike Harrington. Both being former developers at Microsoft for well over a decade, the duo shared plenty of experience in their field and were excited to start something of their own. They wanted to break away from the typical branding structure, with most development studios having an edge or extreme characteristic to their names, which eventually ended up with them settling on the choice of Valve. The company was officially LLC'd on the day of Gabe Newell's wedding, and shortly after began the development of our next topic of discussion. At the time of the game's development, one of the most popular FPS games at that time was Quake, a cutting-edge arena shooter that was boasting one of the most impressive engines of its time. Funny enough, the duo's friend and former co-worker, Michael Abrash, had also left Microsoft in search of other opportunity, in which he was able to get the Valve team a license to use the Quake engine for themselves. Along with their affinity for the impressive engine of id Software, they also wanted to bring a heavy influence of Doom's horror aspects into their new game, stating they wanted Half-Life to scare you like Doom did. They also took inspiration for the game's narrative from the Stephen King novel, The Mist, and an interesting amount of their level design being inspired by the manga series Akira, and thought these all sound like wildly different directions to take an idea, but in the end, the risk definitely paid off. They initially had a bit of trouble in finding a publisher for the game, due to the fact that they were a brand new company with no previous sales, but Washington-based publisher Sierra Online were willing to take a chance with Valve, and after all was said and done, the game eventually launched on November 19th, 1998. Now before we get into the critical reception, let's take a moment and briefly review what it is that made Half-Life stand apart from its competitors. Starting off with the game's engine. While they initially built the game's foundation through the Quake engine, Gabe Newell had stated that 75% of the engine's final version was being ran by Valve's own personal coding, meaning they essentially took the Quake engine and tweaked it to their liking. They were aiming to innovate the use of physics in their game like never before seen, and design each level with a plethora of dynamic effects. For example, damages such as bullet holes, broken windows, and collapsed ceilings all having a lasting effect and would permanently change the landscape of your experience. Slippery floors would send players sliding, grenades could be bounced off of walls and other objects, and random objects such as crates could be maneuvered to your liking. And we've come to find mechanics such as these to be commonplace in the games of present day, but back in 1998, this was next level stuff. The game also provided a satisfying level of platforming and puzzle solving, all of which were a great way to break up the monotony of a typical run-and-gun formula. Not only did they enhance the experience of first-person shooters to a whole new level, they also created a universe that's led to an insane run of classics ever since, with the story of Gordon Freeman and Black Mesa being a topic of discussion for many fans and enthusiasts for multiple decades now. And going back to the time of its release, it's clear to see why. The critical reception of Half-Life was met with a near-perfect response, winning multiple Game of the Year awards and being given a standing ovation by almost every major critic. To this day, Half-Life holds a number 28 spot on the Metacritic list of the greatest games of all time. It's one of the most influential games of its genre, and is an experience that still holds up in present day. So if you've somehow found yourself missing out on this masterpiece, I definitely recommend giving it a playthrough. But going back to the Metacritic list of greatest games, this next entry on our list is impressively holding the number 1 spot. So without further ado, and with the utmost respect, let's take a moment and revisit The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. For as long as video games have existed, a debate has been formed with a wide array of opinions. A debate that begs the question, what is the greatest video game? And while any answer to that may be a subjective opinion, I think we can place enough facts behind our next entry in order to prove that its reputation is worthy of such a title. The Legend of Zelda series had first begun on February 21st, 1986, with the very first game being released on the NES and boasting an impressive mix of puzzle solving, RPG mechanics, as well as an influence of action-adventure, really made it stand out greatly among other games of its time, and its steadily growing fanbase were eagerly awaiting its next entry. Shortly after, the sequel was released only a year later. This time around, the game's co-creator, Shigeru Miyamoto, was looking to create an evolved experience from its predecessor. For example, they decided to ditch the original top-down perspective for a high-fidelity side-scrolling view, putting more emphasis on the RPG elements found in-game, as well as the introduction of Shadow Link, a character that went on to have multiple appearances in later releases. As you can imagine, these changes were met with some mixed reception, sparking an ongoing debate on whether the second game was an improvement or downgrade. But with the majority of fans just being happy to have a new Zelda game to play, the second entry once again sold incredible numbers, and even found itself selling out multiple times. With success and great favor for Nintendo and their latest IP, it was safe to say that the Zelda series was going to be sticking around for a while. And with a handful of other entries being released throughout the late 80s to early 90s, let's take a trip back to the day of November 21st, 1998, to what many claim is the greatest game of the series, that being Ocarina of Time. The release of Ocarina of Time is probably in the top 10 of most iconic days for gaming, as this was a title that quite literally shaped an entire generation, being given almost perfect scores by every gaming publication known to man, and over 9 Game of the Year awards, eventually made for this game being regarded as the greatest game of all time. Ocarina of Time is the definition of masterful development, and has become the epitome of gaming nostalgia. But with such big shoes to fill, what was it that made this game so special? Well, let's begin with the visuals. While the majority of Zelda fans had grown accustomed to seeing Link in his 2D form, Ocarina of Time was the first to bring the world of Hyrule into a 3D perspective. Making use of the N64's incredibly impressive 64DD system, Ocarina of Time had boasted varying milestones with its use of intricate level design, dynamic backgrounds, as well as all of its cutscenes being rendered seamlessly in the game's engine. Another reason for its success was in its ability to tastefully blend genres. Borrowing many elements of RPG and action-adventure, they were able to create some incredibly unique innovations, many of which are still used in present day. The game was also very generous in introducing its players to the many new changes found in-game, with a wide variety of mini-games that would teach as well as reward players. And not to mention, Link's fairy comrade by the name of Navi, being a unique way to give its players direction throughout their journey. The game's world is vast, with many different characters to interact with, and tons of hidden areas to explore. The combat and targeting system were a breath of fresh air, and most of all, the game was just an absolute blast to play. Many argue that the fate of the N64 could have been vastly different, if it weren't for the release of Ocarina of Time, and given the fact that it revitalized the need for the console, I'd say that I agree with that statement. Before the release of Ocarina, the N64 was falling short on its roster in comparison to the plethora of major titles being released on the PS1, and with the target release for Ocarina being set on the 1998 holiday season, they really couldn't have picked a better time. The game sold over 1 million copies in its first week, and quickly became the best-selling game of that year, and with only 39 days left in the year to do so. It influenced future gaming in almost every way possible, and showed players how quickly games were evolving at the time. While you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who hasn't experienced Ocarina of Time just yet, I'd love to hear some of your favorite memories spent with the game, especially if you got it for Christmas that year. But moving forward into our journey of this iconic year for gaming, I thought we could revisit a game that I was much too young to be playing back in the day. But for all my klepto gamers out there, you're sure to find a relation with this one. So get your water arrows ready and check your pockets as we dive into the felonious world of Thief: The Dark Project. The mechanic of stealth had become a very common theme for multiple big releases in the year of 1998, with titles such as Tenchu Stealth Assassins and Metal Gear Solid all sharing the common theme of stealth-based gameplay. The idea of hugging corners, scanning radars, and sneaking your way through levels had become an exhilarating thrill for fans of such games, presenting their players with a tense experience that was rewarding to overcome. And for the ambitious development team at Looking Glass Studio, they were hoping to take a stab at their version of stealth in an even more sophisticated way. While the game's concept began as an action role-playing game titled Dark Camelot, they eventually scrapped this idea, once being denied by their marketing team. They opted for keeping a good majority of the Dark Camelot level design for the new project. They had stated that the concepts for this game were coming to a dead end, with no real plot other than mindlessly chopping people to bits. So rather than focusing on the concept of making the game about first-person sword combat, they wanted to make those ideas a secondary factor and begin their primary focus on thievery. Thus began the concept of the game being about a young thief named Garrett, who is recruited by a mysterious order called the Keepers. Essentially a den of thieves who teach Garrett everything they know, which eventually leads with Garrett leaving the order, becoming a mercenary thief, and a free agent of sorts. So as you can imagine, the game was about stealing things, but it wasn't as simple as picking people's pockets or selling questionable goods on Facebook Marketplace. This game was designed to make you work for your score, and implemented some deeply ambitious mechanics for doing so. The team at Looking Glass had aimed to make the majority of assets in game to be interactive. For example, you're given a selection of different arrow types that you can use, with water arrows being used to take out torches for better hiding spots, and the moss arrow, which is used to cushion louder surfaces, making your footsteps less noisy. And much like we've seen in the Hitman series, many different items such as glass bottles and other objects can be thrown around to distract enemies. They knew that in order to make the gameplay exciting, they needed the AI to be extremely sophisticated, but they quickly found it wouldn't be an easy job to accomplish. While most stealth games of the time would depend on visual cues or line of sight to ensure stealth, Thief was aiming to make every element a factor in ensuring your sneaking was immersive, meaning the audio would require a sophisticated system to simulate what noises could and couldn't be heard by lurking NPCs. Shadows and lighting would have a realistic effect, and most of all, the AI to behave in a somewhat believable fashion. A year into the game's development, a multitude of issues had plagued these ideas from working, and Looking Glass were facing pushback from their publisher, Eidos, which brought them to the reality of possible downsizing and even cancellation of the project as a whole. But in a pivotal turn of events, the team's lead programmer, Tom Leonard, had pitched an idea for completely rewriting the game's AI system, in hopes of correcting all issues found in the AI's response to stealth. And with the deadline for the game swiftly closing in, it meant that some major crunch was about to ensue. In a recent interview with the Looking Glass founder, Paul Neurath, he recounted this moment, stating that Tom had endured about 3 weeks straight of 14-hour shifts, and miraculously rewrote the coding without a single flaw. These changes, along with the inclusion of the stealth meter in the bottom of the game's UI, had finally perfected their vision in the game's design. And after all was said and done, Thief the Dark project was finally released for the Windows PC on December 1st, 1998. Being met with major praise in its ambitious mechanics and unique gameplay, Thief had quickly became a household name for fans of the stealth genre. Its impact had even further succeeded its predicted niche audience, becoming one of the highest rated games in '98. It featured a level of immersion in its gameplay that still puts a lot of present titles to shame, and offered something incredibly different from the average game. The series went on to make 2 more sequels, with a reboot being added in 2014. But when it comes to a true sneaking experience, it's always best to stick with the classics. So do yourself a favor and grab this game for cheap. It's well worth a playthrough even after all this time, and is an experience that is sure to be memorable. Just don't forget to check your corners. You never know who could be watching. When looking back on some of my favorite memories as a young gamer, one thing that I miss more than just about anything is the excitement of couch co-op. Thinking back on those late summer nights with 4 or 5 friends staying the night, playing video games into the early morning hours, eating snacks and debunking the latest Easter eggs we found on cheatplanet.com, it was an incredible time to be alive, and I'm forever grateful to have been able to experience that golden era of gaming. But getting back to the topic at hand, our next entry is a certified couch co-op classic. I'm talking about Mario Party on the N64. Few games have been able to divide and bring together a room like the Mario Party series, spanning a wide roster of games that are still being released in present day. But in typical fashion for the sake of this video, let's travel back to the original and revisit the roots of this classic series. Going back a bit further to the 80s and 90s, board games were steadily rising in popularity, with many celebrated games such as Monopoly, Candyland, and The Game of Life being the average family's Friday night entertainment. But with the steady rise of video games quickly becoming the newfound champion for at-home activities, Nintendo thought it would be a brilliant idea to create something of their own. But this time around, it would be virtual. They partnered up with Japanese developers Hudson Soft, who took over the project of turning the world of Mario into an interactive board game, implementing 6 different characters from the Mario universe and including up to 50 different mini-games. The game's plot would be simple. Mario and friends get into an argument over which of them would hold the title of Superstar, and in order to settle this feud once and for all, they set out to play a variety of mini-games against one another, earning stars along the way. Whoever comes out on top with the most stars wins, and that's pretty much it. And really, that's all you need. As we had mentioned before, the game was designed in the form of a traditional board game, with 6 different boards being themed after each character, all equipped with a variety of minigames. You roll dice, move spaces, and compete in minigames for the prize, as well as the ability to affect your opponent's gameplay with a wide selection of pickups and powers. It was a super simple concept, one that was familiar to just about anyone, which is part of the reason why this game was so successful. While the game could technically be played alone, where it really shone was in its multiplayer. With up to 4 players being able to compete at once, this game led to many fun-filled nights of the late 90s, presenting itself with a charming atmosphere, lovable characters, and plenty of laughs to go around. But all wasn't fun and games, as there was actually a large number of Mario Party related injuries being reported to the New York Attorney General's office at that time. Because of a variety of the minigames requiring players to rotate the analog stick in high speeds, some players were getting friction burns and other lacerations due to the rough grip of the analog stick. These complaints resulted in Nintendo having to pay the state $75,000 in legal fees, as well as to produce a glove that was made to protect players from future injury. Which, if you ask me, is totally hilarious. I mean, I've seen some wild gaming injuries in my day, but friction burns is crazy. Other than that mildly humorous controversy, the game fared well among critics, but more importantly, has become a staple in the childhood of multiple generations. This game united families, friends, and even enemies at times, and gave people a positive way to spend time with one another. It's one of those games that I owe a lot to for some wonderful memories, and if you've got any Mario Party memories of your own, I'd love to hear in the comments. Let's revel in nostalgia together. But moving on to the next and final entry on our list, it's definitely another staple of my childhood. So ending things off with another gaming icon, I present to you the Speed Demon himself, in Sonic Adventure. Closing off our list of historic gaming greatness comes a title that is believed to be one of the greatest of its franchise. But going back to its conception in August of 1996, a well-known producer and director at Sega Games, Takashi Iizuka, was looking to drum up some unique ideas for their next big Sonic game. He initially proposed that it would be in the style of an RPG, having a greater emphasis on narrative and character progression. The development team began their work on this idea following the release of their Sega Saturn classic, Nights into Dreams. Using the very same engine for the newfound Sonic project, technical issues in development for the Saturn began to pose a problem, but lucky for them, a new console was on the horizon. The Sega Dreamcast was pushing the boundaries of technical limitations at that time, with the president at Sega believing it would be a perfect fit for their new game. The development process was heating up, with the team on board steadily growing as the months rolled on. They chose to keep the game under wraps from the public, with very few screenshots of the project being leaked before the game's release. And although many fans of the series were geared up about having a new console from Sega coming soon, the possibilities of viewing Sonic in all 3 dimensions is really what excited fans the most. And on December 23, 1998, Sonic Adventure was officially released, reimagining the formula of the series, bringing Sonic and friends into a 3-dimensional playground, and soothing our ears with one of the greatest late 90s gaming soundtracks ever. Sonic Adventure was everything that fans of the series could have ever hoped for. Starting with the game's narrative, the familiar face of Dr. Robotnik is back to his old menacing ways, discovering the mysterious entity of chaos and unleashing it upon the world. Sonic is joined alongside Tails and Knuckles in stopping this madness, with a handful of other campaigns being available through other characters as well. It's your meat and potatoes Sonic plot with a decent amount of FMVs and dialogue to keep you engaged in the game's story. But at the end of the day, we're here to go fast, right? And in Sonic Adventure, speed is always the name of the game. Being the first 3D game released to the series, the world of Sonic was looking more incredible than ever before, and in the case of this game, it's the peak of late 90s gaming aesthetic. Sonic was redesigned with a more slim and edgy look to him. The level designs were detailed and functional, as well as a wide selection of minigames, giving it a nice variety. And how could I forget the Chow Garden, which were virtual pets in which you could raise and even form relationships with. It was the fully fleshed out experience you would expect from a game of its era, and was more than welcome to its fans, going on to become the highest selling release for the Sega Dreamcast, with later ports being added to the GBA and GameCube. Sonic Adventure is a classic in every way imaginable, and upon revisiting its nostalgic landscapes, you'll be quick to find out why. It was a testament as to why the series has been so successful for the multiple decades since its inception, and stood out for its ambitious design and well thought out structure. If there's one piece of advice I can give you all, it's to make sure that you don't miss out on this game, as it's one that's sure to satisfy. And much like the long list of incredible releases in 1998, Sonic Adventure stands proudly among some of the best. And so concludes our journey throughout the wonderful year of 1998. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and please feel free to comment down below which games were your personal favorites. This is only the beginning of our journey throughout the golden age of gaming, so please do me a solid and drop a subscribe if you dig this type of content. We've got plenty more on the way. But as always, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Stay safe and stay blessed, my friends. Peace out.